Assalamualaikum, Dr. Umran. Am I audible? Can you listen to me?
Yeah, I'm here now. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
So we will wait for 3-4 minutes, then
Yeah,
we.
of course. No worries. Yeah. I'll just get my slide ready.
So we shall start our webinar. Dr. Umran, is it okay? We shall start?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
it's all good.
Okay,
Yeah.
we shall start. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Nahmadu wa sallallahu Rasul Kareem. Amma ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. The respected Head of the Department of Political Science, Associate Professor Dr. Shaza Shukri, and the respected Head of the Policy and Area Studies Research Unit, Dr. Muir Alif, and the respected Director of Peace Dialogue and Xenophobia Studies Center at IIUM, International Islamic University of Malaysia, Associate Professor Dr. Daniel Yusuf, and the esteemed colleagues of the Department of Political Science, and also the respected participants who have joined with us today from all parts of the world, and the guest speaker for today's event. I warmly welcome you all to our highly anticipated special webinar on between Zionism and Islamophobia, far right's shifting position on Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Today's event is organized by the Policy and Area Research Unit, which is under the Department of Political Science at International Islamic University of Malaysia. The event is organized in collaboration with Peace, Dialogue, and Xenophobia Studies Center at International Islamic University of Malaysia. So I am your moderator for today's session. My name is Dr. Muhammad Fawz Muhammad Zeki, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here at IIUM. Actually, we are thrilled to have each and every one of you here today. So before we dive in, let me take a moment to express our gratitude for your presence. And today's discussion between Zionism and Islamophobia and the far right shifting position on Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The purpose of the webinar is which aims to unpack a complex and evolving dynamic in the contemporary global politics. Traditionally, far-right movements in the West were often associated with anti-Semitism. But yet in the recent years, we have witnessed a dramatic shift. Many of these groups now champion pro-Zionist positions while simultaneously foiling Islamophobic narratives. So this apparent contradiction reflects deeper ideological recalibrations. Support for Israel is increasingly framed through the lens of civilizational clash, where Israel is portrayed as a frontline state against radical Islam and the far-right visions of Western identity and security. At the same time, Muslim communities, including Palestinians, are frequently framed as internal and external threat. Our discussion today seeks to interrogate these dynamics and trends, what explains the far-right embrace of Zionism, how does Islamophobia shape their geopolitical perspectives, and what are the implications for justice, peace, and the minority rights. To take us deeper into these discussions, we have invited an expert who is none other than Dr. Omran Sharofi. Let me introduce briefly our guest speaker to our audience. Dr. Omran Sharofi is a postdoctoral researcher at Vergier University, Brussels. I think I pronounced the name of the university properly. And he completed his PhD in politics at the University of York. In his PhD project, Dr. Omran examined the emergence of pro-Israeli far-right parties in the West Europe. His research interests include far-right studies, far-right ideology, German politics, and populism and anti-populism. He has published in globally reputed journals such as Journal of Political Ideologies, Political Studies, and Race and Class. So we are very much honored to have him with us today. And finally, let me share a few information. That's about our speaker. And finally, let me share a few information about today's program. Firstly, the speaker, Dr. Omran, will present his ideas for roughly 30 to 35 minutes. Then we will open up the floor for Q&A session and comment session. The participants can ask questions directly, or they can write their questions in the chat box. So we will read it out for the speaker. And with that note, now it's time to listen to our speaker. Without further ado, I would like to invite again Dr. Omran to share his ideas with us. The floor is yours, Dr. Omran.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Zaki. I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, no, thank you very much for the introduction and also for organizing this. It's great to be with you all. And I realize there's a time difference, so I'm grateful you're all staying up late to listen to me. I hope it's not too boring. Should I share my screen, my slides?
Yeah.
And 1 second.
Can you share?
Sharing, it says sharing is not turned on. You have a
Can
record.
you make Dr. Umran as co-host so he can share it?
Let's see. It says
Still? Mm.
oh no, I think it should work now. Yep, it's working good. 1 second.
Yeah. Yes.
1 second. So which screen can you see? Can you see the
Yeah, we can see the slide, but if you put the yeah, it's okay. We can see. Yeah,
wait, is it the presenter view? Hold on, let me do the
yeah.
right one. I want to share
It's
the
smaller not fitting to the screen. Yeah,
exactly. No, 1 second.
yeah. It's okay.
Oh,
It's okay. Yeah, it's
no, but
possible.
it's nice to have the right one. Hold on. Sorry. There's always these problems with
Yeah,
Zoom.
yeah. It's normal.
It's now let me see. No, God. Mm, sorry, 1 second.
Yeah, so
Where did sorry?
yeah.
Okay, I'll try something else. Hold on. Is that better?
Perfect. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's easier anyway.
Yeah.
So again, thank you for the introduction. And yeah, I think Dr. Zaki did an excellent job at talking about today's presentation. And yeah, it's about the far right, the West European far right, and its position towards Israel and Palestine, some of the shifts, and perhaps I'll try and kind of give an explanation of how to make sense of this. Yeah, so the talk might not last a full 30 minutes, but that's fine. I think that will give us some time to ask some Q&As put some Q&As at the end. So, to give you an overview of today's talk, first of all, I think it makes sense just to quickly briefly discuss what the far right is, because it's a term we often use, perhaps without fully knowing what it refers to or what it doesn't refer to. And then I'm going to start by looking at what is, I think, as Dr. Zaki correctly said, quite a puzzling phenomenon, which is the emergence of pro-Israel far-right parties, at least some of them in West Europe and further abroad. And then I'm going to try to offer a theoretical way of understanding this through the politics of us and them, maybe give you a brief history of how the far-right them and us has shifted and changed over recent years, and then perhaps try to kind of show how the pro-Israel stance of some of these far-right parties fits within some of these shifts. And then also I want to maybe end by talking about how this is not the case for all far-right parties, emphasizing the fact that there is no one single far-right. And then finally wrap this together by offering maybe some comments on what this tells us about far-right politics more generally. So what is the far-right? I guess as you may be aware, it's the study has grown massively in recent decades. You go on Google Scholar, you put in the word far right, and you're going to find every day new articles. It's grown massively, and we have a small table here from Kaz Mudder from 2016, if I'm not mistaken. Again, Kaz Mudder is one of the leading voices, one of the leading writers in the field, and he already showed then that there was more being published on far-right parties than all other party families combined, which is quite incredible, really, if you think that there's more published on social democrats, conservatives, left-wing parties combined. So the far right really is the field of far right studies that has exploded, which comes with problems that you could argue is perhaps becoming a bit saturated. But there has been some development in terms of conceptualizations and definitions that can help us going forward. And I think many scholars now agree on this term far right as an umbrella term to capture far right politics. And I'll explain briefly what this umbrella term refers to. Now, I think to understand the far right, it's useful to briefly reflect on some developments in the post-1945, the post-war era in West Europe. Now, so 1 second. Now, as you could imagine, following the Holocaust in West Europe in 1945, far right politics was heavily ostracized. There was a large stigma around far right politics, anti-Semitism, ultranationalism. These were associated with the Nazi regime, with horrendous acts of inhumanity. So far right parties really did not do very well. They did not fare well electorally, and they were considered pariahs. And in a sense, they had been thrown on the dustbin of history. And then what we see happening is that in the years that followed, from the 60s onwards, there was a kind of, I call it a rebranding, a rethinking, a way to try to kind of change how far right parties are perceived, how they position themselves in a way to kind of overcome this ostracization. And I think some of these changes are best symbolized best by some of the French far right intellectuals known as the Nouvelle Droite, which is the French for New Right. And I think, and what they try to do is try to think, well, how can we change the way we talk, so that we become perhaps more acceptable? One of the key things that I think that came out of this movement was a shift from biological racism, which was kind of, let's say, this kind of idea that there are different races and there are better and worse races, this kind of very old kind of Nazi discourse, and a shift to a kind of more cultural racism where people start talking about different cultures. And this is something we'll come back to in a moment. So this was a kind of shift, and this kind of this focusing on cultural difference was less taboo, and it was perhaps more acceptable to a wider audience. And then, in a sense, what happened then, and scholars would argue that from the 70s onwards, a new type of party emerged. A kind of new far right party that was distinct to the kind of fascist parties of the interwar period. And these parties, it was argued, no longer were openly racist. You could, again, argue whether or not that's the case. And by and large, accepted the rules of democracy. If you think that the interwar period, the far right was very hostile to democracy and wanted to overthrow the system, create a new system, we see the emergence from the 70s onwards of a new type of far right party that, in a sense, is playing by the rules of democracy, taking part in elections, trying to win elections, and perhaps also accepting when they lose the elections. So, reflecting on these developments, today, we can think of there being two main types of far right parties. These kind of older, unreformed parties, ones that kind of look and sound more like interwar fascists, the extreme right, and newer parties, which would often be called the radical right, the kind of newer reform parties. And I think it's important to think that, to reflect on the fact that often today, when we see newspaper articles or reports or even academic work, people more often than not are referring to these new types of radical right parties. And for example, some of the key texts in the field, Kaz Mutter's text, Populist Radical Right Parties, they're detailing the key ideological components of these parties. And also, I think, this is perhaps not relevant for today's talk, but there's been a shift in recent years in the study of the far right, and perhaps an increased focus on the mainstreaming of far right ideas, or how perhaps the center right and far right are kind of coming closer together. So you can see how there's another shift, if you like, in the study of the far right. So in a nutshell, this umbrella term far right that I mentioned before, if you think about the right wing as a broad field of ideas and parties, we have, let's say, the center right, conservative, Christian Union kind of parties, and the far right, which is kind of to the right of the centre-right. And within the far right, we can think of there being two main types of parties, radical right and extreme right. And I think all of these conceptualizations need to be taken with a pinch of salt. In reality, things are a lot messier, and some of these dividing lines, it's often not that clear cut in reality, but I think it's an abstract model to help us understand this is quite helpful. Now, and sorry, this is just a table taken from a recent publication I had, which I think I try to kind of summarize some of the key differences between the extreme right and radical right. Think about the extreme right having a fascist lineage, being non-democratic, openly anti-Semitic and Islamophobic, and let's say biologically racist, and the radical right being, either newer parties or parties that have disavowed their fascist past, nominally democratic, played by the rules of democracy. They've publicly disavowed anti-Semitism. Now, these might still, questions have been asked about how sincere this is, but they are definitely much more openly Islamophobic, and there's this kind of shift towards a more cultural racism. Now, that's just some background, I think, which will be helpful to understanding the phenomenon I'm talking about today, which is the West European far right and its position towards Israel-Palestine. So what I'd like to do today is start with, let's say, a puzzling phenomenon, and then maybe work back towards a theoretical explanation to help understand this. So the phenomenon that I'm looking at, and that was at the focus of my PhD, was the emergence of these kind of pro-Israel West European far right parties. I mean, you're probably quite aware, you may be aware of some examples, but just to give you some examples here, this is a trip from Matteo Salvini, who was deputy Italian Prime Minister of Italy, and as part of the 2008 coalition. This was a visit he made to Israel, where he criticized the EU's policy towards Israel. Here we have an event I also looked at in a previous article in 2010, where four far-right politicians visited Israel, went to Jerusalem. This is Philip de Winter from the Flemish Vlaams Belang, giving an interview while there. We have someone called Tommy Robinson from the anti-Muslim English Defence League, a kind of far-right activist group, and here he's taking part in a pro-Israel march in London in 2023, if I'm not mistaken. And here more recently, we have the AfD in Germany. This is a branch of the party, so the Alternative for Germany, the far-right party of Germany. This is a branch of the party in Berlin. And this was on the 7th of October 2023, and they posted on their Twitter page, "Solidarity with Israel. We attack the, we trying to think of translation. We disavow the Islamic terror of Hamas and the anti-Semitic outbursts in Neukölln. Neukölln being a part of Berlin with a high number of citizens with a kind of migration background." So these are kind of, I think, puzzling, quite counterintuitive, and this is where I'm kind of starting from today. And I'm trying to make sense of this. I think it's kind of useful to think about the way that far-right politics is often based on inclusion and exclusion. Yeah, the construction of us and them. I think it's quite key to how far-right parties and how far-right politics works. And I think if we take some insight from discourse theory, I mean, discourse theory, we don't need to know much about it. It was something that's been, it comes from a kind of post-structuralist, post-Marxist school of thought. There are different ways of understanding it and applying it, but I think what's useful for us here is that by looking at this theory, we know that us, who we are in political projects, often only takes on meaning through its differentiation from them. So the two, us and them, are deeply interconnected with one another. So I think what we can gain, or this theory is helpful in thinking, is that we become perhaps aware that political alliances, the way that us is constructed, is not necessarily natural. Often the way that alliances are built is not based on natural shared interest, but rather as constructed, often through a party or a leader, or through the identification of a them. Yeah, I think it's quite a useful way of thinking about how far-right politics functions. So thinking about us and them, I think it's then it's useful to maybe reflect on how both them and us has shifted over recent decades. So I think first of all, looking at them, and I think when we think about the far right, we often think about them as being the other, a key to far-right politics. Again, repeating what I said earlier, we know that there's a long history of virulent anti-Semitism on the far right in West Europe. So in a sense, the old them, or of many far-right parties in the interwar and immediate aftermath of the Second World War was clearly they were targeting Jews and Jewish populations. But again, we see this kind of shift. Yeah, we see the shift from 1945 onwards. These new types of far-right parties, and this shift is partly in a response to the taboo of open anti-Semitism. I think in most of West Europe, I think it's very difficult for a party to be electorally successful if they are openly anti-Semitic. Now, they may still be anti-Semitic, they may still use codes of anti-Semitism, they may still tolerate anti-Semitism among their membership, but I think it's very rare to see a successful radical right party now campaigning with anti-Semitic slogans. So in a sense, what some argue is that the far-right parties have swapped enemies. So what we've seen is, through shifting to this focus on cultural difference rather than biological difference, we see the fact that the Muslim has become, the Muslim has become the new other of many successful radical right parties. Now this shift, if you like, it's not the case that every far-right party in every far-right actor in West Europe now is no longer anti-Semitic. I think you still have some far-right parties, maybe more extreme, old-fashioned far-right parties that are still openly anti-Semitic, but electorally they are increasingly insignificant. Perhaps one or two exceptions, like the Golden Dawn in Greece. So if this was the old and new them, so the shift away from, let's say, the Jew is the enemy towards the Muslim as the enemy, there's also been a shift in us. And I think when we think about the far right, we often overlook the fact that far-right politics is not just about creating a them, it's also about creating an us. Yeah. And what we see, or the argument is what we see, is that far-right discourse in West Europe, especially among radical right parties, it's not just about the nation. I think these parties still are very much nationalist, and the nation still takes on a very prominent role in the discourse. But there is increasing attempts to talk about Europe or Western civilization or even Judeo-Christian values. So the us is no longer just about the nation. I'm not saying this somehow supersedes their nationalism, but I think it can exist in parallel in different contexts. And what we also see is the way that some far-right parties, ones that are trying to kind of become electorally successful, they're trying to appropriate or trying to include previously ostracized groups. So we see appeals to kind of gender discrimination, trying to kind of position themselves as a defender of women, often in this discourse that positions Muslims as the new sexist threat to kind of white women. But there have even been appeals by some far-right parties, even some like the Front National or the Vlaams Belang, which have a history of anti-Semitism, whose history is very much embedded within kind of anti-Semitic ideology. They've seen attempts to appeal to Jewish communities, trying to kind of say that they are the defenders of Jews in Europe. Yes, it's quite an incredible shift. But of course, this is not always successful, and I think many Jews are skeptical of the attempts of these parties to try and position themselves as defenders of Jews. But this discourse, this positioning, it also serves another function in the sense that you portray Muslims as the new anti-Semites, and you try to claim that anti-Semitism does not exist among indigenous Europeans and has somehow been imported from the Middle East and elsewhere. So there's an interesting shift where these parties should themselves are the heirs, are the successors to anti-Semitic politics in Europe try to then outsource anti-Semitism onto the new Muslim other. So just to kind of, why this is relevant is I think that this pro-Israel stance, and it's more than just this, but I think what it partly is, it's a novel manifestation of the far right's us and them. So for the pro-Israel far right, Israel shares our Western values. Yeah, so it's not about Israel sharing our national values per se. I think it's about Israel and the respective party and the respective nation being somehow united in their Westernness. Yeah. So we see a chain that similarly unites Europe, Israel, even sometimes Christianity and Judaism against a common other. And this shared other is this globally operating Islam threatening us. Yeah. So somehow we, whether we're Belgians or Dutch or Germans or whoever it may be, in Israel, we're all united now in this new discourse through our Western values, our civilizational values against this new global other being the Muslim. So this, I think, what's revealing about this is it shows how this is an antagonism that does not exist purely on a national level. Again, I think if we think about far right politics, it's common to think about far right politics being very nationalist, which it still is. But I think the pro-Israel stance reflects a willingness to kind of create antagonisms beyond the borders of the nation state, some kind of global antagonism or the West versus Islam antagonism, which I think is quite revealing and quite novel. Now, to give you an example from what I mean here, this is, sorry, the screenshot's not very clear. It's taken my PhD looked at the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, the far right party in Germany, in the Bundestag and some of the statements they gave. This is a screenshot from one statement from one of their MPs, Anton Friesen, and he says Israel's politics is rational and patriotic. They trying to kind of position themselves as kind of united. And what I mean by the us and them of the kind of the pro-Israel far right, we see that the way that this is some different statements that the AfD gave during the previous parliamentary term. Here, the AfD is the party of Israel's friends in this parliament. Another quote here, the AfD faction in the Bundestag is serious about the fight against anti-Semitism and stands on the side of Israel. Against this kind of, we are on the same side, us and the AfD in Israel. Or here, Israel is the only Western democracy in the Middle East, which is threatened by the same Islamist terror that has also cost many lives in Europe. So again, they're trying to kind of position the same other, Muslim Islamist terror, and then this kind of us. And then again here, them. So who is them? Who is it that's threatening Israel in Germany or Israel in Europe? And there's an interesting statement here from the AfD where one of the MPs says the BDS movement, so you might have heard of it, the boycott, divestment, sanctions, the pro-Palestinian movement, is referred to as the link between left-wing and Muslim anti-Semitism. This common front is directed against Israel, Germany, and the West. So again, this us, Israel, Germany, the West is us. And then who's them? It reaches from Iran to the Greens, the Green Party in the German Bundestag, Hezbollah to Black Lives Matter, from Hamas to Fridays for Future. So we have this really weird, murky them trying to kind of attack us. And this kind of, what unites them seems to be this kind of like murky Palestinian Islamist power somehow underpinning this. But I think, and this is what I tried to talk about at the start, there was also variation. Yeah. So it's not the case that every far right party is somehow now pro-Israel. Here's an article taken from a statement given by the lawmaker Christos Papas from the Golden Dawn, which is a kind of a more extreme far right party in Greece. And he called Israel the internal enemy of the Greeks. Yeah. So you can see how there are some far right parties that haven't undergone this shift, if you like. So I think of these parties normally, kind of more like neo-fascist or old-fashioned extreme right parties still, some exceptions, still remain quite hostile to Israel. And I think these parties, coming back to what I said before, I think they're more likely to depict an antagonism along more national lines. I think they're more again, it's not to say that the pro-Israel far right is not nationalist, but I think these parties are much more exclusively nationalist in their discourse. But also in terms of variation, I think it's worth bearing in mind that far-right parties themselves are not monoliths. Yeah, there's variation. Again, take the AfD, a party I looked at a lot in my PhD. You have very pro-Israel statements in the Bundestag, but you'll find other parts of the party in the East where you have people maybe questioning, making comments, revising Germany's history, or trying to kind of suggest that German soldiers during the Second World War were not all criminals. So you see, there's also a variation. I think it's difficult to kind of think of a single party having a single position. So I think what I'm touching upon here are general trends, perhaps trends that are more true for the party leadership, but different branches might not be saying the same sort of things. So what does this tell us about the far right? What does the emergence of pro-Israel far-right parties tell us? I think it tells us, on the one hand, that the far right, us and them, are not static, but they shift and change, sometimes dramatically. Yeah, so there's nothing saying they're not pre-given. Yeah, so different far-right parties in different contexts, and again, I should have mentioned before that it's an important disclaimer. I'm looking here at West Europe. I mean, there are different parts of the world, of course. I mean, don't need to tell you. And there are the far right, the far right, us and them will depend on historical reasons, geographical reasons, context, parts of the world. Yeah, so it's quite clear that there is no pre-given us and them of the far right, but it will depend on the antagonism that is relevant to a particular actor in a particular place and time. Yeah, and then so what I think is the case here is that the far right support for Israel, all those parties that do support for Israel, the inclusion of Israel as part of us is deeply entwined with this targeting of Muslims as the main other. Yes, I think these two things go hand in hand. I think it's impossible to understand the way in which these parties position Israel as us without understanding how this us is about really trying to kind of pin down the main other as whether it's Muslims, global Islam, some kind of global threat. I think more broadly, and this is something maybe we can discuss, I think a lot of these, some of these parties that are very, very openly, often proudly pro Israel or would position themselves as kind of Zionists, they still tolerate a certain degree of anti-Semitism or have high-profile members who are anti-Semitic. So we see this kind of quite perplexing development of maybe kind of anti-Semitic pro-Israel parties. And I think this demonstrates the fact that it can be quite counterintuitive and perhaps not logical the way in which the far right constructs its alliances. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for listening. Yeah, happy to answer any questions. And of course, there are different ways to understand this phenomenon. This is just one way, but I'm happy to maybe discuss some other ways of trying to understand this in the questions and answers. So
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Imran, for a wonderful and very structured presentation. I think I'm sure that everyone enjoyed your presentation. And now it's a time for Q&A session and comments. You can write if you want, so we can read it out to our speaker. Is there anyone can raise their hand and ask the question?
Don't be shy. Any questions, fine.
There is a question, yeah.
Should I answer the question?
Yeah, you can answer. Dr.
No,
he is the head of policy and area studies.
No, it's a great question, and it's a very good question, and I think that's something true as well. I think that's something that I didn't touch upon today, and I think it's I think on the one hand it's about us and them, but I also do think he's correct in pointing out that it's about the fact that Israel represents something that appeals to many of these far right parties. I think Israel, especially recent governments, they quite openly prioritize their Jewish character above their democratic character. They see themselves as the homeland of the Jews, and therefore there's a it's like a an ethno-nationalist a color that is appealing. I think people have pointed out that Israel is increasingly an ethnocracy. It's a democracy for one ethnic group. And I think there are parts of the far right that would like to emulate this in Europe. So I think that's definitely an important ingredient and something that is key to understanding this. Maybe just adding to that, I think that also kind of highlights that. I think it also highlights the kind of democracy that some of these far right parties are speaking about. So when they talk about democracy, if you listen to them, what they're talking about is a democracy for a particular group. They're not, they're questioning the right of, let's say, non-natives to vote in national elections. They want to perhaps even deport people. They want to make it more difficult for people to vote. So I think a lot of these parties would like to have a stronger ethnocracy at home, and maybe they look at Israel and think, well, Israel can do it. Maybe we can try to replicate that to some extent in our own nation state.
Is there anything, Dr. Umran, is there any factor that is playing out in the background, like the Israel trying to project themselves generally as something being victimized by the international universal laws and international human rights accord? So Israelis been, I have listened to some far right politicians. They imagine the Israel as a real, true, reflecting the true essence of nationhood by defying the international international impositions of global universalist values upon the national sovereignty. So Israel is something really resisting that. So that resistance towards the universalism is it something attracting these far right parties to express themselves freely, beyond the limitations of democracy and beyond the limitation of human rights discussions? So far right parties want to actually stigmatize minorities, going beyond these human rights discourses. So do they see Israel is some kind of that free expression against universal values? So any resisting defyingly against this kind of discussions, is that attracting the far right parties in the West to replicate Israeli model in their countries, actually, just to defy the global human rights discussions and many many resolutions just try to prove that Israelis have committed human rights, but Israel is still resisting it and just go on its way to do whatever it wants to do to protect their nation. This kind of victorious mindset is driving the far right and West to replicate it in their own country. Is that a factor to be?
No, I think it's a good point. I think it builds on the previous comment, and I think there's a sense that I can remember. You may have remembered the Great March of Return, where you had Palestinians walking towards the fence or the wall separating Gaza from Israel, and there was dozens, if not hundreds, of Palestinians were shot by the Israelis, and obviously it was condemned widely by human rights organizations. And there was an interview given by a member of the Front National, the far right party in France, now called the Rassemblement National. And then I forget who it was, but one of the members said, "Look, the response is tough, but it's just what they're saying is these borders are borders. You try to step over the border and you'll be shot." I'm paraphrasing slightly, but you can see there's something about the way Israel defends its borders that they kind of feel like, okay, I wish we could do the same.
Yeah.
Like you said, a disregard for certain conventions of human rights that I think maybe they do think, yeah, I wish we would deal with our enemies in the same way. So I think this, and like you said, I kind of, Israel is a very powerful country now in the Middle East, and I think there's, like you said, a certain disregard for conventions, international law, and maybe some of these parties would wish their own countries would behave a bit more like that. So yeah. I can see some more questions in the group.
Yeah, I have. Yeah, you have made it clear. Yeah.
So maybe I'll start with
Mm.
Dear, why do some far right groups support Israel even though they're Yeah, I mean it's a great question. I mean, this is I mean, I think what it shows is that it's important not to conflate Zionism with some kind of genuine, let's say, support of Judaism. And I think I think it's possible to kind of have a positive image of Israel while remaining anti-Semitic. Because, I mean, either because you believe in this idea that every ethnicity should remain in its own country, and you kind of almost think it's there's a kind of you can understand why certain racists like the idea that each country has its own race and that our own culture, our own religion. That's how the world should be. It's kind of an ethno-pluralist idea. But I think also that I mean, I think there are often contradictions. I think it's you can see. I mean, I think you see even within Jewish thought and among the Jewish community across the globe, you see this division between those Jews who support Israel and those who don't. I think some of the biggest opponents of the most recent war in Gaza have been Jewish voices across in the States or across Europe. So I think I mean, it shows you shouldn't conflate the two, and I think you can support Israel as some kind of, you see it as some kind of like ethno state defending the West. You can support it on this level, but you might still have some anti-Semitic beliefs about Jews being backwards or somehow being some kind of controlling the world. I think those things can exist. It's kind of perplexing, but I think this is what I think far right politics can often be. You can see a kind of a package of things that on some level don't fully make sense.
Is there another question? Yeah.
Let me see. My question may be basic, but I'm curious, why does it? Maybe the second question here, and maybe why does that? Yeah, I'm trying to maybe would Humara be able to kind of repeat the question slightly? I'm trying to kind of
Yeah.
Like, hello, Assalamualaikum.
Hi.
Okay, so basically, like earlier, I joined a bit late. I have like a very poor understanding in politics. Let me just let you know in advance. But what I wanted to ask is that in the almost last slide, I saw that the anti-Semitism is talked relatively to the pro-Israel, as if like anti-Semitism is the hatred toward Jews, right? But then like, is it why it's like slowly turning into pro-Israel? Like, isn't it Israel is like majority is like filled by Jews, even they are filled like almost all over the continent. So it's like why the anti-Semitism is almost like no longer exists. It's like slowly, it's closely related to the pro-Israel, and slowly it's like disappearing as the times goes by.
I mean, if I answer correctly, I'll try and answer. So I think, I mean, I don't think it's the case that anti-Semitism is disappearing in, let's say, across the world or not in Europe. What I think it's about is that I think, and I hope this answers the question. I think a lot of these parties realized that one of the reasons why they were finding it difficult to be elected, were associations with Nazism, with anti-Semitism, with interwar period, and I think and there are different parts of this question, parts of the puzzle. I think some of these parties came to the conclusion that by being openly pro-Israel, you can somehow change your image in the public. Now, I think this is partly because people conflate the two. So people think that somehow by being pro-Israel, you're not anti-Semitic, whereas I would argue it's not the case. I think you can be both pro-Israel and anti-Semitic. But putting that out to one side, I think these parties, I think there's clearly a motivation here. It's a strategic decision to kind of think, well, if we come out in support of Israel, go to Israel, visit the Holocaust Museum, speak about how we defend Israel, that in the ears of people will hear this and think, oh, I thought these parties were anti-Semitic, but they support Israel, so they cannot be anti-Semitic. So I think it's trying to kind of disassociate from anti-Semitism, but at the same time, it's about trying to kind of re-signify or change how anti-Semitism is understood by trying to depict it as a Muslim problem, by saying no, the only anti-Semites now, this is what they argue. I mean, it's clearly not true, but they would argue the only anti-Semites now in Europe are Muslims. So somehow it's about trying to shift the discourse and to say we are now pro-Israel, therefore we are not anti-Semitic. And if you're worried about anti-Semitism, you should join us in attacking the Muslims. It's about trying to kind of create this shift. So to try to kind of publicly disavow anti-Semitism and maybe just to outsource it onto the Muslim other. There's a great book, forget the author's title, called, I think, what's the book called? I forget. It's about also the way that anti-Semitism has been kind of outsourced onto Muslim migrants in a way to try to.
Something is like
Sorry.
an idea which was introduced during World War, like anti-Semitism, World War II or something, like hatred towards Jews, slowly turning back like toward Islam right now. It's like as if Muslims are being attacked as this second choice after anti-Semitism. Muslims is like they are like exchange it. Last time because of World War II, the Germany like bring the hatred toward the Jew people. But now they totally changed the idea to different thing in order to attack Muslim people. Is it?
Yeah. And I think often it's not the same, but I think often there's a kind of similar logic. And like you said, there's been a shift where, some of these parties that also who clearly were much more openly anti-Semitic are now their target is the Muslim. They talk about Islam as a threat, about the oncoming, this kind of great replacement, about this global threat. So yeah, it's really much. I think, like you said, really, this shift is also about, on the one hand, trying to kind of publicly disavow anti-Semitism, but yeah, to really then portray Muslims as the new enemy that we have to somehow defend ourselves against. So that's definitely clearly part of the picture.
Doctor, there is another question, third one.
Yeah.
It's using it's the same kind of question, yeah.
Look at different fields. Yeah, it's a good, interesting question. Are you using this on purpose, like a strategy? I mean, I think it's definitely partly strategy. I think I mean, my argument would be it's kind of both. To support Israel in the sense of what these parties claim it represents. We can argue about what Israel represents in reality. I mean, I think there's no one single answer, but for a lot of these parties, I mean, Israel is this kind of proud ethno-state, like you said, Dr. Zaki, that disregards international law, that kills, so-called terrorists, that is kind of proud of its cultural identity and is strong, has a big military, is kind of aggressive. So I think it's about trying to kind of support this idea of how a nation state should operate, but also it's about fearing Muslims by trying to kind of fearing Palestinians by trying to portray Palestinians and, let's say, Hamas or whatever else it may be as just kind of one monolithic Islam. It's trying to kind of say Palestinians equals Hamas equals Al-Qaeda equals ISIS equals basically every Muslim in the world. So
Mhm.
trying to kind of create this chain where somehow you're saying they're all the same, you know? So I think it's both trying to kind of support what Israel represents as an idea, but also to really kind of, you know, to fear Palestinians as kind of as these kind of dangerous Muslims who live on your streets.
Mhm. Thank you, Dr. Umran. I think, is there any other final question? I can allow someone for the last. Yeah. There's a final question. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think they put it as a cultural. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think on paper they position Islam as a cultural threat because they say that, you know, they will say things like, "We don't have a problem with Muslims. We only have a problem with Islam," and they would say Islam as a culture is not compatible with European values. Now, this is obviously, I think, it's strategic because they know they can say this, and then it's more difficult to accuse someone of saying that of being a racist. But in reality, you look at some of their campaigning materials and the way they talk about this, they position non-white brown people as a threat. So on the one hand, they say it's a cultural threat, but in reality, you kind of scratch the surface, you look at the logic, it still is a kind of there's still quite a strong kind of ethnic racial side to this. You know, if someone has a poster saying "Stop Muslims" and a picture of like dangerous looking brown men, there's still quite a strong racist kind of racial element to this. So I think it's portrayed as a cultural threat on paper. I think these parties are very careful to avoid any language that sounds like biological racism. But I think often the underpinning logic and often the way this is depicted, it's kind of essentially like a racialized position as a racialized threat.
Thank you, Dr. Umran, for your insightful presentation and the very nuanced answers that actually trigger our mind to further explore the discussions and the discourses. And so we are, I think we have to wrap up our today's webinar. And again, I thank all the participants and the guest speaker for joining with us today. And I want to express our deepest gratitude to our main speaker, Dr. Umran. When we invited him, he actually accepted our invitation. And though many back and forth conversations, we finally settled for today. And it was actually a wonderful presentation. I think our students and others this session is recorded and will be uploaded in the YouTube, so our students and anyone else in the world can watch this as they wish. And so Dr. Umran, thank you very much for sharing your insightful observations on far-right dynamics in Europe and within the broader context of Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And also a big thank you for our incredible audience for their engagement and questions. And also I would like to thank finally to our head of policy of Area Studies Research Unit, Dr. Mir Alif, and his team for facilitating through wonderful arrangements this webinar to run the webinar very smoothly. And so with that information, finally, I would like to give you another information that this is a series of webinars. This is the second webinar that we just had with Dr. Umran, and we will have another webinar on far right. This webinar series is on far right dynamics in the emerging world. So we will have another webinar on the 16th of May. There will be another guest speaker who is Dr. Naveed Bakhli from Canada, and he will talk on the same theme from a different perspective, and Islamophobia, how far right construct Islamophobia. So this is a continuation of today's discussion. So I invite all the participants to join with us in that webinar as well, and which will be held on 16th of May. So with that note, I would like to conclude this webinar with the recitation of the Al-Kafara. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Imran, for your
Thank you very much. But thank you all very much. And the
Yeah.
last question, yeah, it's true. My mother is Irish, so.
Okay.
My supervisors were Irish.
Okay.
So it's it's nice to hear it.
Okay. Great.
Thank you, Dr. Imran. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Have a nice evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.